What is your name and current profession?
My name is Lynne Weintraub. I'm the ESL coordinator at the Jones Library.
How long have you lived in Amherst?
I came here to go to UMass in 1979, maybe.
What does the Jones Library ESL and citizenship program offer?
We work with volunteers who teach English one-to-one to immigrants and visitors to the Amherst area. We help immigrants become citizens. Um, we provide conversation groups and study materials.
How did you get to know the Amherst Cambodian community?
I'm trying to remember. I was a college student. I was learning how to be an English teacher, and there were these churches that had sponsored some refugee families. They just arrived and they needed people to help them teach English. And a group of us just volunteered to help teach English. Some of it was one-to-one, and some of it was in groups. Like I remember a group of people who wanted to become citizens that I worked with. And then the Wesley Methodist Church, in the early 80s, the Methodist Church said that they were going to house this family in the Yellow House, the house next to the church. And they offered me a room in that house in exchange for teaching the different adult members of the family. And so I moved into the house. I got to know that family very well. And it wasn't just English that they needed everything you can imagine, just help with filling out forms and stuff to do with the kids in school and doctors and everything that somebody needs to get resettled in the United States. And I had time on my hands, so I helped them with all of those things. And so did the church. But there were a whole lot of other families, friends and relatives of the Boo family that also needed help. And they started asking me to help. And so I was doing all of this just basic resettlement work with people, not just teaching them English. And I got to know a lot of people, all of the major families in town. I kind of worked with the ones on the north side of town, and Elaine worked with the ones in the south end of town.
When did the Jones Library ESL program start?
The program started in 1985, and it started because the library became aware that there were people in town that were not using the library. Everybody pays taxes to support the library, but the only people who were coming in the door were people who could speak English, who were born in the United States, who had a good education, who could read the books that were there. And there really wasn't any reason for anybody else to come in. But the library's mission is to serve the whole community. So they did a study to see who else was not participating in the library. And what they came up with was these newly arrived Cambodian families, and they didn't come to the library because there was nothing there that would be of any use to them. And they didn't know that the library was available to them. It wasn't something that they were familiar with in their lives before in the refugee camps or in Cambodia. And so the library applied for a grant from the Board of Library Commissioners to put together a tutoring program to help these new arrivals to learn English, the adults, because the kids were already being taken care of in the schools. And so they got this grant, and they hired me to do 20 hours a week of training tutors, doing intakes with the students, matching them up, and supervising the teaching.
How did Khmer speaking students find the Jones Library ESL program in the early days?
I actually had to go out and find them. I spent a lot of time going to events, the New Year's celebration or somebody's wedding or some birthday party or anything I could get myself invited to. I would go, I would meet people, I would find out if they wanted to learn English and find out about their schedules and, all the details that I needed to get them matched up with someone, and bring them to the library. In some cases, we actually had to go to them for the tutoring as well. If there were people who couldn't come to the library either because they were learning at a time that the library wasn't open, or they didn't have transportation, or they were taking care of babies, or for whatever reason, we also did some of the tutoring outside the library.
Who were your Khmer speaking students in the 1980s?
I can't name too many of them. I remember Chenda Chim, Tuch Heave, Lynne Heave. I don't know. If I went back to my records, I could name you the names. And I do have records still of everybody that came to the Jones Library for tutoring. I'm giving them to you guys.
What were the challenges you faced to teach English to the Cambodian adults who came from the refugee camps?
There were a lot of challenges. We didn't have a lot of materials that were appropriate for these kinds of students. I mean, most of the materials we had were designed for people who could already read and write to some degree. And these were, by and large, rice farmers. They didn't have a lot of education even in their native language, which is not to say that they weren't knowledgeable. They were. They could recite poetry and sing songs and tell stories and lots of great things, but they couldn't read. So we sometimes ended up having to invent our own materials, especially for citizenship. And I wrote materials that eventually became the textbook that people use across the country now if they're teaching very low-level students. These Cambodian adults that arrived in the 80s taught me how to write materials because nobody else was going to do it. It was hard because they had a million other problems besides not speaking English. They needed everything. Some of them had health problems. Some of them had trauma that there was no way to address. There were people trying to take care of a lot of kids at the same time and also trying to take care of their elderly parents. People desperately wanted to bring their relatives out of the refugee camps where they were in danger, but they needed help with the immigration forms, and they needed, in a lot of cases, to become citizens in order to sponsor people. And they needed help getting jobs and keeping the jobs and dealing with money and finding safe places to live. And I could go on and on. There were just so many things. And a lot of the tutors ended up being, in a sense, like social workers or personal assistants. I don't know what you would call it. And there wasn't enough time to do everything plus teach English. It was a complicated thing that we didn't realize how complicated it was when we first started out.
Did your program help with other needs besides English language?
Before the library even started doing this work, I was working with a group of just volunteers, mostly people from the Center for International Education at UMass. And we had a group of people who wanted to become citizens. And I remember teaching that class. It was such a long time ago. But so I did a little bit of citizenship work, and then the library program started, and we were supposed to be just doing one-to-one English instruction. I think that citizenship wasn't so much on our radar. But I remember Tooch. She desperately wanted to get her son out of a refugee camp. She had to become a citizen, and she kind of studied on her own, but nobody knew what to study then. She went for an interview, and they asked her, "What is the Constitution?" Could you answer that? What is the Constitution? And she didn't know, and they failed her. But you get a second try. And when I found out about that happening, I was pretty upset. So I tried to find out exactly what it is that these examiners ask citizenship applicants and make sure that she would pass the second time around, and she did. But that put it on my radar. So I knew that in addition to learning English, people needed to learn the history and government information that they would be asked at these citizenship interviews. But there just weren't any books for that. So, like I said, we just invented our own materials. And they had to be at a really easy reading level, and they had to have like illustrations to support the meaning of the text, and it had to be written in language that would be accessible to beginners. And like I said, there wasn't any such thing, so I wrote it.
You took a year off in 1990. Where did you go?
So all of these Cambodian families had arrived in Amherst directly from a refugee camp in the Philippines. It was called the Philippine Refugee Processing Center. And they spent 6 months there tying up medical details and immigration details and, figuring out who was going to go to live where, depending on where they might already have relatives, for example. So during the 6 months of processing, they received English instruction and cultural orientation to the United States. And all of that was conducted by Filipino teachers, and the camp hired Americans to supervise those Filipino teachers. And a couple of people I knew from this group of volunteers from the Center for International Education had already gone out to work in the refugee camps, and I started to get the idea that might be interesting for me and useful for the library to find out how the refugees were processed before they got to us. So I spent a year out there supervising teams of teachers and getting to know the refugees, right off the boat, kind of. And then I came back to my Jones Library job.
How did you learn about Khmer history, culture, and language?
I read a lot, but I also asked a lot of questions. I was just really curious. It was a whole different culture, as different as you could get from the one that I grew up in. But I liked the people that I was meeting, and I was just really interested. So I would just try to find out from anybody who could tell me, how did something come about, or why do people do things differently than what I'm used to, or how do people look at a particular situation differently than I do. I mean, that's what I do with all of the groups that I work with at the library now, but that was my first adventure into learning about another culture. And it's not easy because people can't always describe their own culture to people. The best way to do it is sort of compare. Well, in my culture, we do child raising this way, or people look at education that way, or marriage customs, or there's just like a million different topics that you can talk about that are going to be different between you and the people you're learning about. And they can't really describe it. Their culture, you can't really describe your culture unless you find a way to contrast them and explore it that way. So I did, and I spent a lot of time observing. I loved going to the temple. I love just taking pictures of people and observing them in a, the environment that they were comfortable in. I loved hanging out with the children. I loved the stories that they used to tell. I guess I learned a lot that way.
What was your favorite part about Khmer culture?
I liked the temple. I felt a strong affinity to Buddhism in general. And I eventually did go to Cambodia, and I loved looking at the old temples and taking pictures of them. I can't explain to you why. I just love it. I also love that the culture is very oral. Like, people love to tell stories and sing songs and recite, and they always had a really entertaining way of doing it. I don't know if your parents do that now, but the old folks that came over from Cambodia, they were amazing. And they would do it sometimes in English, but in the Cambodian way of doing that, of, reciting something or singing a song. It was lots of fun.
Are you still in touch with Amherst Khmer families that you met back in 1980s?
A couple, yeah. I run into people now and then, and there's a few people that I've stayed in touch with all through the years. Not all of them stayed in Amherst. Some of them are far away, and I don't get to see them very often. Some of them moved to the West Coast, and I don't see them at all, and I miss them.
What were some intergenerational challenges that families experienced?
So the younger members of the families were the ones who learned English faster. And so they ended up doing a lot of translating for their parents and for their grandparents. But it was in no way a suitable thing to have a 8-year-old translating about medical issues or mental health issues or the supernatural kind of things that the elders believed, but the Americans couldn't understand. It was a very awkward position to put those kids in. And some of them did better than others. I remember when Long Bu was in high school, she was required to take swimming. So she had to get a bathing suit. And her father did not. Her father was very sort of a conservative Buddhist. And when he found that bathing suit in the wash, he cut it up with scissors. And I heard about this from her, and I asked her, "Are you upset?" Because she had to have a bathing suit. There was no choice in the matter. She said, "No, I just got another one. And this time he won't find it." And I remember another father who found his daughter's Halloween costume. She was just a little girl, and she wanted to be a gypsy, I think. And he saw it, and he said, "My daughter doesn't dress in rags." And he threw it in the trash. And these kids, how could they know how to deal with that sort of thing? It was a lot to ask. But they figured out a way to make a bridge from the world of their parents to the world they're living in now. And they just negotiated it as best as they could. Other intergenerational stuff, though, right?
If you could put the mic a little closer to your mouth.
No, ask me the next one.
From your perspective, how have the Cambodian community members grown and integrated into the Amherst community?
I can really only tell you from the point of view of running the program at the library. When they first arrived, they needed everything. They needed help with English, but they had even more urgent concerns. And so we were helping them with many, many things at the same time. Once they learned enough English to get a job, sometimes they would disappear. I didn't even see them for a couple of years. until the point where they wanted to become a citizen. After being a permanent resident for 5 years, you can apply for citizenship. Then they come back and ask for a tutor again, and we would help them get through that process. And then sometimes I didn't see them again as a student. I would just see them, in the supermarket or at the temple or just in daily life. And they had bought a house by this time, or they'd brought over other members of their family to join them here. And then those family members would become my students, and we would start that cycle all over again. And to tell you the truth, it's still going on. I still have some people coming into the Jones Library who were somebody's granddaughter's husband's mother, who now needs to learn English because she just got here. So the story just continues. The families, by and large, have done pretty well for themselves. They've worked a lot of overtime, a lot of times at UMass or at the factories in East Hampton, and they're homeowners. They rent to other people. They all have nice cars. Their children, a lot of them have gone to college and have some pretty great careers. I think that the community has settled in pretty well.
Thank you, Lynne.
They were working with somebody who was recently arrived here and hearing about the being homesick and all the difficulties with acculturation and all that. I would tell them stories about people students that I knew of many years ago, who, spent years working through that acculturation process and how wonderfully they're doing now. And I'd try to explain to them that this is just, the beginning stages, and the person is not going to be in turmoil or homesick or, traumatized forever. It's just like in the beginning, everything comes at you at once. 20 years from now, they'll be doing fine.
Lynne, can you touch on some of the stories you heard from Cambodians who kind of recalled their experience during the Khmer Rouge and were basically told that none of that happened and no one believed them?
So when some of these refugees first arrived here, they had stories about what happened in the Khmer Rouge times, and they were horrific. They were hard to tell. And they would tell them with this very flat affect. They wouldn't cry. They wouldn't even look sad. There was no expression on their face. And I think that was just because it had been taught to them from an early age not to express strong emotions, because that's a dangerous thing to do in some circumstances. And it's like kind of an Asian thing. But the Americans, some of them would listen to these stories and not believe it. They said that couldn't have happened. That's like something out of a horror movie. They didn't believe it. And so these refugees would stop telling their stories, because what's the use if people think that you're making it up? It was true. I mean, I've read even worse stories in some of the books. So I knew that what they were saying really happened to them, but they stopped talking about it at a certain point. And I wonder if they tell their children what happened to them. It's hard to remember, and it's hard to say, and you don't want to traumatize other people. People would meet a volunteer tutor, for example, and the tutor would ask, how many children do you have? And so the person would have to decide, do I tell about the family I had before that all got killed, or just tell them about the family that I have of children that are still alive with my second spouse? Or, how did you survive in the refugee camp? Or what did so-and-so do for a living before they came here? Sometimes those stories would be really awful. And so you have to decide whether to change this. The refugees themselves would have to decide whether to change the subject or to lie, or just tell a little bit of that trauma, or tell the whole thing. And I think they would just choose their audience. They knew that I would listen, so they would tell me things that made it hard for me to sleep at night. But, maybe somebody else that didn't know very much about the whole Holocaust experience, they wouldn't even attempt to tell the story.